This is Understanding Europe, brought to you by CEREM, the Center for European Research in Maastricht.
Ce premier marché commun, ces premières institutions supranationales, c'est l'Europe qui commence à s'unir.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the third and last episode of this season of Understanding Europe. After discussing the EU democracy promotion in the eastern and southern neighborhoods, we decided to dedicate this episode to understand the EU internal dynamics of democracy, both in terms of EU democratic reforms, as well as the role the EU plays in promoting democracy in its member states. This episode was recorded before the European elections. It's an important episode to understand the how, what, and why of the internal democratic functioning. And by internal, we mean within the EU's different players, whether it be the Parliament, the Council, or the Commission, or even the Member States. To discuss all of this, Brendan and I are joined by Dr. Christina Neuhold, Professor of EU Democratic Governance and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University. So, without any further delay, let's get the conversation started.
Welcome back, everyone. We're here with Dr. Neuhold. Thank you for joining us, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
After 5 years, it's time again for an EU election. We're recording this episode between the Maastricht debate, held 3 weeks ago, and the European Parliament elections, to be held in about 3 weeks from now. This year is quite a special year, since it's a super electoral year across the entire world. Between a quarter and half the planet are expected to go to the polls, between 2 and 4 billion people. With the Indian elections taking place over the past month, the European elections right around the corner, and the pivotal US general election coming up in November, just to name a few, Christine, could you maybe contextualize the European elections for us and how they've developed over the past few decades? What are these elections deciding, and are they decisive to those ends?
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. And the first part of the question was the development of these elections. I think the interesting thing is that the European Parliament has, of course, been set up in the 1950s as a common assembly. But it was not called Parliament then, it was an assembly. And why was it called an assembly? Because it was not directly elected. And it was only until 1979 that it was actually directly elected. And by then, 9 member states were able to vote for the European Parliament. Now, today, we have 400 million people that are eligible to vote for these elections in 2024. And we have, of course, 27 member states. These elections, you might think, okay, 79 was the first shot, so many years ago, so now it must have changed, it must be very different. But actually, we still don't have a uniform system of being able to vote for the European Parliament. It is a variant of a system of proportional representation or the party list system. But member states basically organize it in a different way. So you might think, okay, they had so many decades to be able to develop this, but it hasn't happened. At the same time, that is not such a problem, that we have different ways of organizing elections. But what is, of course, an issue is that I see a lack of debate within the member states on how important these elections are. Because you said, what is at stake? Basically, how decisive are these elections? And these elections are very important if you look at the power of the European Parliament. On the one hand, we say, okay, the electoral system or the power of the parliament has evolved over the past decades. And I think if you ask the average voter on the street, do they actually know what the parliament can actually do? And the European Parliament is, of course, a co-legislator. It wasn't always. In 1979, when the first elections were introduced, it was far away from being a co-legislator. But now it can actually veto legislation, but much more importantly, because it hardly ever uses the veto, it can have an impact on legislation. For one directive, they made thousands of amendments. Yeah? So the European Parliament can, together with the Council, that's also very important, but in a vast array of policy fields, the European Parliament can influence legislation. And I think that's something that most citizens are not aware of, and that is also not addressed at member state level. If you look, I'm Austrian, I was just in Austria. If you look at the billboards, it's about making a difference for Lower Austria in Europe. I mean, what does that actually then mean? First of all, Lower Austria is just one province in Austria. We should be debating not whether Lower Austria or Maastricht or, a certain region or Limburg has an influence. We should be debating policy issues. We should know, okay, if I vote for the Socialist Party in my member state, then this will have such and such an impact on the outcome. The Socialists stand for this, read their manifesto, but also look at what have they actually done when it comes to shaping legislation in the past legislative periods.
I think we should focus maybe on it basically being still 27 separate elections. So you took the example of Lower Austria. These elections are held on member state level, only highlighting local issues and how they relate maybe to Europe, and often even discussing things that are outside of the prerogative of the European Union. How has this maybe evolved over time? Is it still very much only like that, or has there been any kind of change?
Yeah, one thing we've been pre-discussing just now is the idea of transnational lists. And we know that these transnational lists did not materialize. So to give an answer to your question, I still see a discrepancy between electoral campaigns at member state level and actually what is happening within the European Parliament. So we still have a disconnect between both levels. And then when you're doing research, there's always the question, so what? Does this actually have an impact, this disconnect? And then my answer would be, yes and no at the same time. On the one hand, it is a problem that member states do not really address the powers of the European Parliament, nor do they address what their own political party actually stands for and what their own political party has done. At the same time, the European Parliament works in a very ingenious way. And I think that's also something that is not known, that is not discussed. But I think, first of all, it is not so important how many seats each member state has. Because what is so important is the transnational political groups. For instance, I was asked to join a debate on German television, and they were saying it's because Germany is the biggest. So we have to pay a lot of attention, and then we'll look at France because it's the second biggest member state. That's not the question. The question is which political party will gain, and especially which non-affiliated, non-aligned groups will also gain in votes. And what does that mean? What is happening when it comes to the political cleavages within the European Parliament? Are the socialists winning? Are the Eurosceptics, we know that this is not a good term because it's a catch-all term, but are these parties winning? It doesn't matter which member state they're from. It matters so much what political alliances they push for.
I just wanted to ask, this disconnect, is it the responsibility of the EU to handle, or is it a member state level? How do you bridge that?
It's very often the fact that the European Union is seen as a scapegoat, that it's the EU should do something. But what we very much see in the European Union that we are in today is that it's actually the member states that could do more. it's also the member states, we'll talk about that later, I guess, but it's also the member states that are engaged in democratic backsliding. There are a lot of issues at member state level. And then when things get tougher, then it's easy to blame always the level that is not so close to home. So then it's easy to say it's the EU. Because where are the elections being carried out? At member state level. So the European Union can assist. And the European Union can also assist in explaining what the European elections are about. And I went to their website in preparation for today's meeting, for instance, their little videos. Yeah, how many people watch these videos, I wonder, but nevertheless, yeah. But to answer your question, I think it is definitely a responsibility, at least also at member state level.
You touched upon this, but maybe I think we could just quickly go back to it. That's the way that representation actually works in the European Parliament. So the member states have a certain amount of allocated seats. They, on a member state level, then have the election and proportionally divvy out the seats in a unique way, often to each member state, but mostly in a comparable way. And then these parties go to the European Parliament, find ideological allies, and regularly become part of groups. So the Socialists and Democrats, or the European People's Party, being two of the largest. And that's kind of how it functions, right? Is there anything I'm missing?
Yeah, I think you're not necessarily missing something. But first of all, let us go to the treaty. The treaties stipulate that there can be only 750 members of the European Parliament maximum. So we know, even if we have very big member states, such as Germany, we have a limit of seats. So Germany has 96 seats, and that's in the treaty. At the same time, what I found also interesting, when I used to teach about the European Parliament, it was always 705 members. Now, for these elections, it's 720 members. So that's interesting. Before each election, it is the European Parliament that can actually look into the system, revisit the system, and say, in some member states, we have more population growth, and so we are going to allocate more seats to those member states. This is decided on together with the European Council. So it is not the European Parliament that does this by itself. So on the one hand, we have the number of seats. We have the number of seats allocated to each member state. And on the other hand, really, really important are these transnational political groups. So for simplicity's sake, I call it party families. So of course, we already have these party families within the European Parliament, but we could see a new party family moving into the new European Parliament and their rules. There are rules for everything in the EU, and there are also rules for this. So you need a minimum of 23 MEPs from at least a quarter of the member states. So this is also an important rule that actually also guides the way the Parliament works. Because if you wouldn't have this rule of a minimum number of MEPs, you would have many, many different small political groups. And also you have this idea, this transnational element is everywhere. So you have this idea of a quarter of the member states. So it doesn't suffice if you have 23 member states from Italy or Spain. It has to be from a quarter of the member states. So different member states have to be represented in that political group. You might have noticed in the last parliament, if a member moves from one group to the other political group, then maybe this quorum is not given anymore. Yeah. So then they have to find another member from another country to be able to fulfill this rule. Yeah. And at the same time, so you have very often you have in the European Union, you have a combination of three factors. You have the member states. You have that in the European Parliament as well. You have 96 members of the European Parliament for Germany, 6 for the small member states. So you have always this member state component. You always have this link to the member states. In the European Parliament, as opposed to the other institutions, you have very strongly, obviously, because it's a parliament, these political groups. And then you have something else. What do you think it is? You have politics, you have member states, and you have something else. To make policy, you need expertise. That's a crucial, yeah? So I was not framing the question in a way that you can come up with the answer, but that's a crucial thing. And that is also something, because the parliament is a policy maker, it's a policy shaper. How can you know I'm going to do something that I shouldn't do? I'm going to pick up my glass, yeah, to show you. How do you know how much lead, micrograms of lead per liter is admissible before the drinking water becomes toxic? This is not a political choice. This is a factual choice. And then you have to look to the World Health Organization, so you need always expertise as well. And the European Parliament does this by, after the elections, allocating members to the committees, to the standing committees of the European Parliament. And that's another ingenious feature where you have the expertise bundled, concentrated within different committees, such as the Committee for the Environment, the Committee for Social Affairs. And then when you are an interest group or an NGO, okay, there's legislation on the table. When it comes to safety of drinking water, I'll go to the Environment Committee, because the rapporteur comes from that committee. So you have always these three components. You have them in all three EU institutions. You have always the expertise and the member state level. You have that in the council, very much. You need the expertise and you need the member states. Council is intergovernmental. You have that in the commission. There you don't have so much the member states, although we have 27 commissioners and 27 member states. What a surprise. So we have that as well, but we have there the expertise. And within the European Parliament, you have this extra dimension of the political.
I think that actually leads quite well into how the European Parliament then continues to interplay with the other two main institutions, being the European Council and the Commission. You've mentioned a few times that the European Parliament is a co-legislator. When the Commission proposes a new piece of legislation, it goes through the Parliament and ping-pongs between the Parliament and the Council, Council being made up of the member states themselves, usually ministers. It kind of bounces back and forth. So the Parliament, while being a co-legislator, cannot bring legislation to the table, but can edit it once it's there. And how does it normally then kind of work between the three in terms of the political dynamic? So the party affiliation and the institutional affiliation, almost. These two factors that work kind of hand in hand.
Okay. On the one hand, if we have a proposal by the Commission, you very rightly said it's not the European Parliament that proposes legislation. That's the ABC of how the EU works. It's the Commission. This Commission proposal will go to the European Parliament and to the Council at the same time. Then within the European Parliament, one will look at which committee, so here we have the expertise again, which committee is responsible for this piece of legislation? Is this more an environmental issue? Is this more an industrial issue? And of course, you know that policy issues are not neatly delineated. There's overlap. So it might be that two committees are responsible. And then these committees, I'm coming to your question of politics, these committees will nominate a rapporteur, and the rapporteur is from one of the political groups. Let us say, or we have co-rapporteur from two political groups, i.e. from two different committees. So then the one group, let's just for simplicity's sake say we have one rapporteur, and let us just stick with a political group. We have the proposal on, let's just stick with this drinking water directive. It's an old piece of legislation. Or let us look at the AI Act. The AI Act, that's more topical. The AI Act then goes to one committee. Let us say it goes to for some reason it goes to the Industry Committee. And then the Industry Committee will nominate, based on the strength of the political groups within that committee, they will nominate a rapporteur. So you have again the link between expertise and politics. And so to make sure that the rapporteur from one political group, let's say he or she or they are from the S&D, well, then you might say, well, this is completely this is not legitimate. You need to make sure that the other political groups also influence this and are also in the loop. So then these other political groups will nominate shadow rapporteurs. But the rapporteur will be someone who will be very heavily lobbied and will also be someone who is really the negotiator vis-a-vis the other institutions. And then you have the whole thing of trilogues coming in, where the European Parliament delegation negotiates with the Council and with the Commission. So you will also see, and the trilogues have been criticized because they take place behind closed doors, but you will also see that this is actually crucial for making sure that legislation is adopted, because we see that trilogues are almost always there, they almost always meet, and we also see that this ordinary legislative procedure, which used to be called co-decision, most acts are actually adopted in first reading, so very much pre-cooked and prepared by trilogues. But then you will say, okay, but what happens? The rapporteur hammers this out, and then it's supposed to be an institution that's democratically elected. How can we make sure that the other political groups also vote for this? It goes back to plenary. That's really important. So within the European Union, we also always see this interplay between formal and informal. The trilogues are not in the treaty, you probably know that, but of course, co-decision has different steps. And here, of course, the discussion and the voting on in plenary, also in first reading, is extremely important. And then you have the whole spectrum of the parliament with all political groups being represented and being able to vote on this piece of legislation.
And then it goes through. So these trilogues also are something, if I'm correct, that aren't necessarily in the treaties. They've just developed as a natural way of trying to make things work. To take this a step further into kind of the bigger picture, the Council is also made up of the Council of the European Union or the European Council.
It's not the same thing.
In both cases.
The European Council is a separate institution, eh?
Yeah,
exactly.
No,
you know that. Just to make sure.
I think it's a bit confusing.
It is
one,
very
one
confusing.
One is the ministers, and the other one kind of sets the guidelines.
Exactly.
And is the heads of government. But what I meant is, and why I bring both up, is they're also made up of the same political parties that are in the European Parliament. So is the politics then between the Parliament and the Council the same discussions that happen between the parties, or has it shifted to a different debate, one that is more about member state rights versus the European Union's rights and who has claims to what? How does that blur over?
Yeah, a very interesting question. So I think this question has very different dimensions. On the one hand, you're asking whether there are the same political cleavages within the Council as within the European Parliament. In order to answer this question correctly, we would have to look at policy issues, and that would be a perfect bachelor thesis, where you really compare, or master thesis or PhD, where you really compare, issue per issue, what are the discussions like. But we, of course, do see that members of the European Parliament are also influenced by their member states. And we also see something else. This is not exactly your question, or at least you didn't pitch it that way. But we do see that European Parliament discussion, it has been voted on, but then come member state interests. Yeah. So we've seen this also in the case of emissions, car emissions. Here then the industry comes in. And the industry of a certain member state comes in, or might come in, and then suddenly overruling something that has already been, or is very far in the decision-making process in the European Parliament. So here, again, you also see something that I haven't mentioned that much, which is, of course, linked to expertise, but it's about interests. I mean, some of these pieces of legislation that are being decided within the European Union have huge repercussions for industry, have huge repercussions for the environment. Yeah, so it's really a gift to be able to negotiate that balance. And normally the European Parliament and the Council manage to bridge the gap. But sometimes we also see that at the end, member states and also the politics within a certain member states overturns. It is very rare, but that a bigger member state suddenly, against all odds, can influence legislation.
I mean, we saw that recently, I guess, with Germany.
Exactly.
The supply chain legislation.
Yeah, I was also referring to Germany in my head.
I think often. Interesting. I mean, maybe to take a step back to where we started this with the European elections coming up, and we stay on this interplay between the institutions, mainly the Parliament and the Council. The elections take place, we vote for the parties, they then go to the Parliament and form in these groups that we've discussed. And then what happens? Then we've got to find a new Commission president and a new Commission as a whole. So you might refer to it as a cabinet, but in short, there seems to be a bit of a gap between, on the one hand, electing the member state level parties, and then 2 or 3 steps later getting basically the quasi-European government. I think an interesting clip from the Maastricht debate that you helped organize really points this out. And this is in the opening statements between, first it's von der Leyen, the current Commission president, followed immediately by Vistesen, who is the lead candidate for the Danish People's Party, I think.
And he was representing, or he is representing the Identity and Democracy Group, indeed.
Yeah, and von der Leyen is part of the European People's Party,
exactly.
the large center-right party. Let's just have a listen and go from there.
Mrs. von der Leyen, you have the floor.
Good evening. It feels good to be here in this room with you and to share my vision for Europe. My children are more or less the same age as you, and of course you can imagine that we discuss a lot politics at the kitchen table. They care a lot about Europe. You care a lot about Europe. And you were a huge motivation for me during these 5 years with many, many crises to stay the course. And from that experience, going forward, I want a strong Europe instead of weakness. I want unity instead of polarization. I want a Europe that cares, that protects, that prospers. And above all, this election is about democracy. And democracy is about choices. So my message tonight is, do not let others make the choice for you. Your vote counts, and I'm very glad to discuss tonight with you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vistesen, you're next.
Brussels have become a swamp where unelected bureaucrats are going to utilize their vision of a European federalized superstate. And we have to stop that. That's why our campaign promise today is that we will begin by firing 10,000 bureaucrats in Brussels. And I would like to start with you, Ursula von der Leyen. Your Commission presidency have been a disaster. On your watch, millions of illegal migrants have entered into our continent. On your watch, you have been at the focus point of the Pfizer scandal under investigation by the European Public Prosecutor's Office, and not a single European is eligible to vote for you when you took office the first time, nor this time. This is not worthy of a European democracy, and therefore, if it's for us in the Identity and Democracy Group to decide, you will be the first one fired after the elections.
So very emotive opening speeches or opening statements from both candidates. One is running for the parliament and the other isn't. Von der Leyen is the Spitzenkandidat, but isn't running for the European Parliament. And Vistesen points out that she wasn't elected in the European election in 2019, and she won't be directly elected this time. Could you maybe make sense of this a bit for us?
Okay, thank you so much. So, very nice clip. On the one hand, you're right. The Commission president is not directly elected during these elections. On the other hand, we have this system that you have alluded to, which is the Spitzenkandidaten system, the lead candidate system, where according to the treaty, Article 7 of the Treaty of Lisbon, it is the largest political group coming out of the elections of the European Parliament, so the largest political group that gets to nominate a candidate for Commission President, and the European Council then has to approve this candidate. We all know that there was a stark difference between 2014 and 2019. 2014, the EPP won the elections, i.e. was the largest political group, didn't win the elections, but was the largest political group. And then Article 7 was implemented like it should have been. Juncker was the Spitzenkandidat, and then Juncker became Commission President. Who makes sure that this Commission President gets the legitimacy? On the one hand, it is the European Council. So I'm not making a mistake. It's the European Council, the heads of state and government that do the steering, as you so rightly said, who approved Juncker. And it is also the European Parliament by absolute majority. So more than half of its component members is also in the treaty. And in the next European Parliament, we will need 361 seats because we have 720 members, remember? So we need this number of members that will have to come from the political groups. It will not suffice for one political group to vote for the Spitzenkandidat, probably, except if one suddenly gets the absolute majority, but we don't foresee that. So alliances will have to be built across political groups. There will have to be debates. That's one thing. And just to come back to the allegation, it is correct, or allegation to the discussion, it is correct that the Commission President is not directly elected. It is an indirect chain of appointment. And in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen was not the Spitzenkandidat of the EPP, but it was the European Council who then came up with her name. And at the end, she still got the legitimacy by the European Parliament. That's very important. This is then not correct. She was approved by absolute majority by the members of the European Parliament. That was conveniently skipped in your clip. But it is correct, but that is not von der Leyen's fault. It is correct that so far, it's the member states who agree on the treaties. The member states have not agreed to have a direct election of the Commission President. You would then have to have even more debates, I guess, than we have now.
So she was not directly elected, but she did receive the consent of the elected parliament. And this controversy that Vistisen is referring to is basically foregoing the Spitzenkandidat system in favor of still taking someone from the political family of the largest grouping in the European Parliament after the elections, but not somebody who was known. I mean, unless you were very much into German politics, you wouldn't have known who Ursula von der Leyen is. I think maybe this is a good time to move and look a bit into what she did in the last 5 years as Commission President and how that relates to Europe and European democracy. In the last 5 years, the current Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has taken a leading role in the bloc, navigating through Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just to mention a few of the major crises. From the get-go, it has been the goal of this commission to strengthen democracy, being one of the main priorities of the von der Leyen Commission. In 2019, she set out to do this in her sixth priority, which was named a new push for democracy. Could you maybe help us understand the context for this push and how it has developed over the last 5 years?
So there were different priorities. But indeed, priority 6 was giving democracy a new push. And I think that's a very interesting thing. Let me just stand still with the priorities at the moment. On the one hand, you see that the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, wrote these priorities before any of the crisis. So they were set down in 2019, and there was no priority of health. Of course, the pandemic was basically the first thing that the Commission president had to deal with. And I find that she did an absolutely fantastic job. If people attack this commission, you have to think about what it means to have bought the vaccine. Of course, we know also that maybe some things were not exactly like they should have been, but we have a vaccine. We quickly had a vaccine within the European Union. If you would think that each member state would have to organize this by themselves, we would not be sitting around this table. And this commission has saved millions of lives. So I think this is something that is not in the debate. Yeah, my sister's a doctor, and we just talked about that. So I think this is something that is completely eclipsed. Health was not a priority, but they still managed to focus on that. This then, of course, meant that priority 6 was pushed back a bit, because a priority means that you have to be able to focus. You can't focus on 6 things at the same time. So giving democracy a new push was really focused on the Conference of the Future of Europe. And this was also in the priority of the Commission. The Commission very clearly saw that there is this alleged democratic deficit, so this gap between citizens and the European Union. Of course, the Commission doesn't mention the term democratic deficit. This is more a term for academia, but it was phrased in a more positive way, try to give democracy a new push, and the Conference on the Future of Europe is a cornerstone of doing so. Then came the pandemic, and then the conference was pushed back by a year, and also it was supposed to last for 2 years, but it lasted for 1, which I think is efficient.
Maybe just to interject, the Conference of the Future of Europe, what exactly was that?
Yeah. So the Conference of the Future of Europe is really something which strengthens, or is supposed to strengthen, deliberative democracy, is supposed to strengthen citizen involvement. This is new. This was very much new for the European Union. They had these so-called citizen panels where they had 200 European citizens, which were randomly chosen, reflecting the EU's diversity when it comes to age, gender, nationality, origin, socioeconomic background, level of education. So very diverse panels debating on different policy issues. One of them also being democracy, another panel being Europe and the world, migration, another panel focusing more on the environment. So again, we have this link between citizens, member states, citizens, and expertise, policy-focused issues. And they came up with 49 proposals structured around very different themes like European democracy, rule of law, environment, and health. Yeah, so health also was debated. And now, of course, the Commission, but also the European Union as a whole, has to follow up on these proposals. Maybe an interesting footnote is that these panels, these citizens' panels, are actually used by the Commission. Although the conference has ended its work, the Commission is using these panels also to help it develop legislation. We said before, the Commission puts forward proposals. And then, for instance, on a very important proposal on food waste, we had citizen panels. We now had another citizen panel dealing with issues of racism, so debating these kinds of issues and to get the voice of the citizens into the European policy-making process. We had that before already with the Citizens' Initiative, but now it is really about not only bringing in NGOs and interest groups, but it is really about bringing in citizens.
Mm-hmm. So the Citizens' Initiative is in short, that any European citizen, if they get enough signatures, can ask something of the European institutions to deal with some sort of regulation, right? Am I correct?
It is indeed, again, very much regulated. It is a certain number of signatures that you indeed need from different member states. And it would be very difficult for us, me and you and Charelle, to now organize such a citizens' initiative. So normally it is interest groups who organize this. And it is indeed to ask the Commission to come up with a proposal.
So this is a way of civil society kind of stepping in and injecting policies into the
Exactly. So it's civil society. And the Conference on the Future of Europe was really to bring in the citizens' voice. So not only the civil society voice, but also the citizens' voice.
And this was done, not to get too technical, but basically by getting a representative sample of the population, getting them together, giving them people with expertise to assist them, and then deliberating on possible goals.
Yeah.
Right?
Coming up with proposals. Yeah.
Okay. And so this was the plan for the Conference on the Future of Europe, sandwiched between the German and the French, I think, council presidencies. Before the pandemic occurred. This was the plan.
It was the plan, indeed.
It was the plan.
Yes.
Well, it didn't necessarily take place as intended, and also probably suffered from social distancing the same way as everything else did. But it seemed to have a longer lasting effect in the policy process, basically. So now more of these citizen panels are used as a consultative measure by the European Parliament and the Commission.
By the Commission.
By the Commission.
By the Commission in the policy proposal phase.
Okay.
In the drafting phase.
All right.
Yeah.
Maybe we can focus on how this took a sideline. You said that it was a priority, and priorities have to be the main focus, but due to the health crisis, and then probably following that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this took a back foot. In the last couple of episodes, we've talked about how it seems to be democracy promotion and democracy taking a secondary role in a lot of these processes. Do you think that the Commission has been successful in keeping this alive, or has this really fallen to the wayside?
This answer always depends on your standards of democracy, and your standards of also your expectations. Yeah. So on the one hand, let's first of all focus on the glass half full. Democracy was a priority of 6. That's already a lot. Yeah. Health was not. Yeah, and that is a very important policy field. But of course, health is very much in member states' hands. So it's also about thinking about who has the competence. Yeah. But I think it is an important political signal, one, that it was a Commission priority for the whole legislative period, for the whole period of the Commission. So for the whole period of the European Parliament for the last 5 years as well. So that's a good thing. Second, we had all these crises, we still had the conference, and some of the features of the conference are part of our policy-making process. So that's the glass half full. But the glass half empty, i.e. not so full, what about actually reforming democracy when it comes to the internal, and that's what we're talking about today, the internal functioning of democracy? Has the lead candidate system been fundamentally changed? No. Has the system of electing members to the European Parliament been changed by, for instance, introducing transnational lists? The answer is also no. Have we changed the way we take decisions within the European Union? Co-decision, have we extended that since the last legislative period of the European Parliament, 2019 to now? No, because we didn't have a treaty. Yeah, we didn't have treaty change, which I think is a good thing. You also have to have consolidation. You shouldn't always have change. But, some of the things fundamental also to the internal working of democracy have not been changed. But then you have to ask yourself the question, did they need to be changed? And I would say, you didn't ask me this question, but I'm going to ask myself the question. Then I would say co-decision, we don't need to change the way co-decision works, but we have to keep an eye on adopting acts in first reading and also the way that they decided upon in trilogues. So this is something also very much on the radar, for instance, of the European Ombudsman, the way decisions are taken. But I do think it is an issue that the transnational lists, it was about 28 MEPs elected on transnational lists, and that's the European Council who didn't agree to this.
This is a specific post-Brexit proposal
exactly.
to give basically the seats, some of the seats that were left over after the EU,
the 73
the UK left.
Exactly. So 73 seats were left, and only 28 of those allocate them to more transnational lists, and it was the European Council who didn't agree to this. So it's not the European Parliament. So I do think some opportunities have been missed. But it is not necessarily the Commission's fault. It's not necessarily the Parliament's fault. And we also don't always have to finger point. But nevertheless, I think, yes, of course, you could have done more.
And I mean, I think this ultimately brings us to legitimacy being, I think, the underlying question in all of this. How has the legitimacy democratically been maintained or not expanded upon, but maybe de facto, you could see that over the last few years, the Commission has been a winner, kind of gaining competencies to itself. I think the health crisis and the very leading response that was held there. It's strange on the one hand to have that be the case, where more capacity has been given to the Commission, yet with the stalling of any kind of democratic reform. How is this legitimate?
Okay, there's a lot of academic debate on who benefited from the crisis. Let us now focus on COVID. You just talked about the pandemic. And there are academics that say it is the Commission. It's not like the Commission did things which were not legitimate. The Commission has the role, according to the treaties also, it doesn't say that as such, but the Commission has the role of an honest broker. So you could say that the Commission in the health crisis very much played that role of an honest broker, trying to bring member states together, trying to come up with a cohesive stance for the European Union. Then you could say, okay, what about democracy? And I think there was a book 20 years ago, I think by now, what's wrong with EU democracy and how to fix it. And the idea was also, does democracy actually need to be fixed? And I think that question still has to be asked. What is it that we're trying to fix? What is actually at stake? And I think on the one hand, we do have a European Parliament. We do have debates in the European Parliament. We even now have the debates for the Commission President. We do have a way of adopting legislation that seems to work rather well. So what do we need to fix? What we also do need to fix is, the thing that we talked at the outset, that we have European Parliament elections and that people are not aware that this is happening, that people might not even go to, we'll see, we don't know, but will people actually vote for these elections? And I think this is, for me, maybe the most important problem, that we still have these different member state elections, if you so will, and that we're sitting here and we hardly hear anything about the Parliament election, European Parliament elections coming up. And this is such a decisive vote. This is such a decisive event. So it is really nice that you're doing this, because otherwise, we don't hear much about it. So for me, I haven't thought about it. I haven't ranked anything, but I think this is really the thing that we have missed the boat, and everybody missed the boat.
Okay, so since we're on the topic of legitimacy, there is a confusion as to who is responsible for fixing or maintaining the democracy, or maybe democratic practices. And since the last couple of years, we've been noticing a bit of democratic backsliding in some of the EU member states. There is something that, for me, for example, that I don't understand. If the EU is trying, or the current Commission, let's just say, is trying to have a push for democracy, and at the same time, we're noticing this democratic backsliding on an EU member state level, who is responsible to handle this sort of issue? Is it actually the responsibility of the Commission to go to a member state and be like, hey, there's something going on with your upkeep of democratic practices? Or is it maybe a member state level? Or maybe is it something that civil society should be, protesting about it on a member state level? Or who is actually responsible for this? Is it an institutional level, such as the EU and its institutions, or is it the member state?
Very nice question. Again, both. Yeah. So you said in order to maintain peace and to make things work, it's very often not just one partner. It always takes two to tango. So on the one hand, it is, but let me focus on the member states first. Of course, democratic backsliding, for instance, that the media cannot speak out, that judges are reprimanded, that academics are fired because they're doing certain things, that's happening at member state level. So this has been thrown into one of these basket terms or labeled under one of these basket terms of democratic backsliding. That is happening at member state level. So it is, of course, the member states that are responsible for what is happening within their member state, on the one hand. On the other hand, these member states are part of the European Union. When they enter the European Union, they adhere to the so-called Copenhagen criteria, which is also adherence to democratic values, rule of law, etc. So if member states then, and basically they make a deal, we are joining the European Union, we are part of this club, we benefit, we get a seat around the table. As member states, we can also, when it's unanimity, block legislation in the council. So we are very much empowered. So in order to ensure that the system works and that the system is still democratic, the EU institutions, of course, also have a role to play. So it's very easy to say it's just member state. It is also the European Commission, here we go again, that oversees implementation in general, but also in this case. So the European Commission can, of course, and does, take member states to the Court of Justice. But it is, of course, a very multifaceted issue. And violation of democratic principles doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow creeping process. And you see that in public debate, you see that in, the facets that I've just mentioned, suppressing freedom of media, that's the tip of the iceberg. So we see democratic, and I'm thinking of a term that captures it better, but not giving democracy a push, let's put it that way, stepping on the brakes, we see that in many different member states. And that's not only in Poland and Hungary, that's also in other member states. Of course, the one that I come from is also one of them. And it's not, Austria is not, you've named it in one of your questions, but we have several member states or many member states where we also see, and that's not, it's not also the member states alone that are responsible for this. It's also the outcome of elections. We will see, you said that at the very beginning, we are facing a lot of elections this year, super election year. We will probably see that in the European Parliament, but we will also see that member states level, that we see a shift to the extreme sides of the political spectrum. So I think one thing that I thought in preparation for this debate is that the European Parliament elections are taking place, and all the elections, also the one in the US, are taking place against the backdrop of enormous polarization in society. We have more, I don't know if we have more polarization than ever. I haven't been around enough, so I don't know. And I don't know if we have more crises than ever. I would actually dispute that. I think we've had more crises in the past, at least I hope so. Just think of the 1940s, yeah? But nevertheless, I think we are in a time where we have rapid transformations going on. So I think it's not so much only about who is responsible for what. It is also very much about contextualizing what is going on. And what is going on, there we see enormous polarization. And so the member states have to grapple with this polarization, and the EU institutions have to grapple with that polarization.
I think this brings us to a nice concluding moment for our discussion. But before we wrap the episode up, we have a last segment. We call it secondary sources, where our guest speaker would give us secondary sources which people can read or hear or watch if they want to explore more into this topic. So do you have any suggestions for us?
Yeah, I would suggest that people watch the debates. They're also not only the ones in Maastricht, but also other debates by the Spitzenkandidaten. I think that's very immediate. The next thing I would do is to go to the European Parliament website and look at the little videos and make up your mind. Did you know all this? Is this new? What would you do differently? Yeah. So then zoom out a bit more on the meta level to look at what is going on. How are people informed about the parliament elections? And on the other hand, I'm an academic. So I think the two texts that I would suggest for people to read is there's a text, I can give you the exact reference, but I think it's from 2006 by Simon Hicks and Andreas Follestal about the democratic deficit in the EU. It's a very short article, and I think that gives you a very nice summary of what the democratic deficit was like then, almost 20 years ago. But many of these things still stand, and it's in a nutshell. It is contested, this article. There's some other people who say that there is no democratic deficit, but we don't have time to go into that. I'm sure you would ask me a question. But okay, that's for the next time. So this article, and on the other hand, democratic backsliding, I think the person to go to is Daniel Kehlenman, who also wrote something in 2012 on that. So I think, those are the immediate academic sources I would go to, complemented by the videos and the Spitzenkandidaten debates.
All right. Thank you very much. We will make sure to link those suggestions into the description of this episode. And I think this brings this episode to an end. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Dr.
so
Christina
much.
Neuhold, for this conversation. And to everyone who's listening to us, thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll talk to you soon, hopefully. This podcast episode was produced, recorded, and edited by Brendan Hogan and Charelle Abdullah. The music for this podcast episode has been produced by Stone Ocean.